Hello everyone, and welcome to the video for Unit 9 within Module 3. This unit is on power and influence in organizations. So I want to highlight a few things briefly for you here that you are to look out for in both your readings and in the video lecture that you will watch. So you have a fairly lengthy video lecture by Dr. Robert Cialdini that you'll watch in conjunction with this unit. Dr. Cialdini is arguably the leading scholar in the area of power and influence. So he will provide the bulk of the lecture for this unit, but certainly it is backed up by the material in the text. I think that has in this particular unit has a number of rich stories and examples that will really help to illustrate some of the core points. So let's talk by drawing out some of the key definitions and ideas that I want to make sure that you're paying attention to. So I want to give you some questions to consider, some guidance on how to listen to the lecture and how to read the text. Now, the first thing I want you to consider: what is power and what is influence, and why do you need it? So there are two different things, power and influence, and even in this lecture we'll start to differentiate them a little bit, but it'll become quite clear as you do your readings and you listen to Dr. Cialdini, the difference between power and influence and how each is important and how each is achieved. You also want to think about who has power within organizations, the organizations that you're a part of. Why do they have power, and what are their sources of power? What are their sources of influence? How did they get it? And similarly, what type of influence do you have? What type of influence do you want, and why? And how do you cultivate that influence? It's probably more likely that earlier in your career, you'll have the ability to have influence early on. Power is something that is gained more formally, as we'll talk about in just a moment. All right, so these are the things I want you to be thinking about, especially in terms of your own self-assessment and your own development. But let's dissect some of the core concepts that I want to make sure that you're paying attention to and that you have clarity on as you read the text and watch the videos. The importance of influence is the first thing that I want to highlight up front, because I think it's often misunderstood. This idea of power and influence, we're not talking about it in a maniacal or manipulative or Machiavellian way where we want power, influence for power's sake. What we're hoping to achieve is to gain influence in order to have an impact, to have an effect on outcomes that are important to us and to the people that we represent. So influence is important because it facilitates cooperation from a range of constituents, employers or bosses, subordinates, customers, suppliers, unions. If you have influence among these different stakeholders, you can help to negotiate solutions, you can help to get people's needs met. So influence becomes an important feature of coordinating efforts and of helping people to achieve goals. And it could be that you're achieving influence not only for yourself, but also for the people that you are representing and working beside. Powerful individuals can get jobs done, they can secure resources, and they can get others on side. So influence ends up being a very important feature of leadership, as we're talking about in this class, of negotiation, of sales, and of teamwork. As this little diagram indicates, influence is the central competence that all the soft skills have in common. It is something that is core to management, to effective business functioning. So I want you to think about an example, and I'm hoping this example will give you, help you to start to think about how influence differs and how it differs by context and by person. This is an example of a small fish, big pond. After graduating from university at the top of her class, Joan was ready to set the corporate world on fire. Soon after landing a job in a top brokerage firm, she was determined to move up the corporate ladder as fast as possible. Unfortunately, she soon found that nobody really cared about what she had to say, and after a month, her co-workers started avoiding her. Joan could not understand how she went from being so influential in university to being nobody at work. There's two questions below here for you to ponder. How would you explain to Joan her lack of power and influence? And two, what advice would you give Joan on how to obtain power? You can take a minute to think about this, stop the video if you would like, and to jot down some notes. But you might, so I'll pause for a moment. Okay, so you likely have come to some conclusions here that I think are likely dead on. That Joan's lack of power comes from moving from an environment at which she was at the top of the class. She was a strong student. She was in her final years of study, so she was more senior to other years. So she had acquired and amassed a fair amount of power through her efforts, right? Through demonstrating her competence in her classroom, and also through having the experience of having completed the first 3 years of university. And then moving into the world of work, she moves to the bottom of the corporate ladder and has yet to do anything to prove herself. So she needs to acquire influence through her behavior, through her actions, and through her performance. How will she go about doing that? Well, let's unpack that a little bit more. I'm pulling out here a chart that is actually in your text on page 276. This chart lays out sources of power. Personal power versus positional power. Personal sources of power include expertise. So if Joan could just become the best at something or find something that is unique to her that she's able to contribute within the organization, that's a source of power. There's also your track record. If you have done something well and you've developed a reputation for competence or for efficiency or for a particular skill or outcome, this can be a very helpful source of power. Interestingly, as another source of personal power is attractiveness. This falls under the principle of liking. We tend to like people that we're attracted to, people who look the part within an organization, who look like, if you're a banker, you look like a banker. And those types of signals signal competence, and liking signals. When we like somebody, we're willing to give them a little bit more credit. So that ends up being another source of personal power. Finally, we have on this list, and this is, of course, talked about in great length in your text. Finally, we have on this list the idea of effort. If you are seen as somebody who puts a great deal of effort into things, that you work for it, that you're adequately putting your best foot forward, this can also be a source of power. And finally, this idea of positional power. Positional power comes from where you find yourself in your network of people. And we'll talk about social networks in a little bit more detail in the next unit. But positional power can come from a few positions or a few locations within a social network. One is a location within a hierarchy. If you hold a position of formal authority, if you're a boss, a supervisor, if you are a leader within the organization, that of course gives you formal power, legitimate power. But you can also get positional power from being central to how things operate. So if you are, if the work that you do is relevant, if the work that you do seems to be core to the organization, there's a relationship between what you're doing and the organizational objectives, that can give you power. If the work that you do is central, meaning that a lot of the efforts flow through you, you hold a key position in the network, that can also be a source of power. Next, we have autonomy. This is the amount of discretion you have in your position and what you're able to do. Having more discretion and more discretionary movement is a source of power. And finally, visibility. The degree to which your performance, the outcomes of your performance, people are aware of them, people can see them. That will also give you power. So again, these ideas are talked about at length in your textbook, but I think they're important to highlight here. As it's important to understand how you acquire power and influence within an organization so that you can plan for how you want to create both your the work that you do, how you do it, where you find yourself within the network, and also this idea of gaining personal power. The last thing I want to do before I close off this unit is distinguish quite clearly between power and influence. So we've talked about power at length. Influence is the ability to have an impact on the beliefs and actions of others. It is non-coercive, so it's not authoritarian, whereas power can come from positions of authority. Influence is really a set of abilities or skills that can help you to have an impact on others, and it does not require positional authority. The lecture that you'll watch by Dr. Cialdini goes into great depth on this idea of influence and ways of acquiring or having influence over others. All right, so that is the end of the highlights for this unit. I encourage you, of course, as always, to read your chapter. These are two particularly interesting and engaging chapters, and to also watch the lecture by Dr. Cialdini and participate in the other activities happening on the module. Take care. See you next time.